Hello everybody and welcome to the video. So today we are jumping into our next unit of study, and our next unit is going to be evolution. So evolution is pretty cool because it's going to try to help to bring together a lot of the topics that we've talked about so far this year, and we're going to be able to consider a lot of the things we've talked about all at once. So it's kind of a nice culminating unit for us to try to wrap up our year. All right, so when we start off, we first want to think about some different theories of evolution that have come about over time. And when we think about our class in particular, this shouldn't be the first time that we've heard of evolution. We did talk about evolution much earlier in the year. When we talked about the 8 characteristics of life, we defined evolution as being the ability for a species to change over time. So that's the same definition we used earlier in the year, and it applies to now. Evolution is the ability for a species to change over time. And when scientists kind of realized this, they kind of saw that species were able to change as time went on. There was kind of a lot of different ideas that got thrown out there, kind of thinking about how this is possible. How are these species able to change over time? And one of the first main ideas that came from the scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he came up with what was called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And his theory more or less said that changes to an individual during their lifetime caused by use, disuse, or the environment get passed down to their offspring. So his idea is that if an individual changes in some way during their life, those changes will then get passed down to their offspring. And the really popular example that Lamarck actually used himself was an idea of a giraffe. So we start here, kind of an original short-necked ancestor, so someone much earlier giraffe, maybe millions of years ago. And what basically happens during this giraffe's lifetime is that they're right here, they're able to get to this tree, but if the tree gets too high for them, Lamarck's idea is that the giraffe was able to stretch their neck a little longer, and then if the branches got higher, they can stretch their neck even longer, and then even longer so. So this is one giraffe kind of changing throughout their lifetime. And Lamarck's idea is, so this one individual is able to change over their lifetime, and because this was good for them, they would then pass on that trait to their offspring as well. So this seemed like a fine idea at the time. However, Lamarck's ideas were pretty quickly disproven. If we think about this logically, this wouldn't really happen. I have a fun cartoon that I think kind of demonstrate this well. What we can kind of see is this baby here who kind of looks like he's a bodybuilder after just being born. And the caption is, "All I can say is my wife worked out every day when she was pregnant." So what they're demonstrating here is just because there is a change to an individual and they have offspring, it does not mean that their offspring are also going to have those same traits. If you're a very muscular person, that doesn't mean that your baby is going to be super muscular when they're born. Another example of this is, for example, if either a human or an animal were to lose maybe an arm or a leg during their lifetime. They were to lose one of their limbs and then they had a child, it doesn't mean that their offspring is going to be born without that limb. Just because something happens to the parents doesn't mean that same thing is going to happen to the offspring. So while it was a decent idea at first, Lamarck's ideas were pretty quickly dismissed. However, we come to our kind of second main idea. The second thinker was actually kind of inspired by the thinking of Lamarck. This thinker you probably have heard of before. He's called Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin is a really important guy when we think about evolution. He came up with what is called the theory of natural selection. So how we define natural selection, it's kind of difficult to put it in a concise statement. But how we can think about it is that individuals of a species have different traits that make them more or less likely to survive, therefore affecting their ability to create offspring. So I know that's kind of a lot wrapped into one statement, but it's basically saying that individuals in a species are going to be different. So say that people of the human race, people of the human species are going to be different from one another. Some people are going to be taller, some people are going to be shorter. We're going to have different eye color, hair color, skin color. Those all make us different. And in certain situations, those characteristics are going to make us more or less likely to survive. We as humans don't need to worry about this. This applies much better to other animals and living things. But those traits affect their ability to survive and therefore their ability to create offspring. And when we think about the theory of natural selection is widely accepted to be the main way in which evolution occurs in nature. So when you think about evolution, the theory of natural selection is kind of the main theory, the main idea. No one has really found a way to disprove it yet. So because it hasn't been disproven per se, it's kind of what scientists accept to be the best idea of what we have so far. Sticking with this ideas of giraffes. So when thinking about Darwin's thinking about how giraffes might have changed over time. So we see here way back in time, there's two different giraffes. One giraffe is going to be shorter than this other giraffe. They're living at the same time. And it's clear that this taller giraffe is going to have better access to this tree. So they're going to be able to get more food. They're going to be able to grow, survive better. And this shorter giraffe is going to have a tougher time getting food, which is going to make it less likely that they'll survive. Because this taller giraffe is better at getting food, they're going to be able to create more offspring. And these taller offspring are going to become more and more common in the population until over time, the average giraffe neck length is going to get longer and longer because in this situation, it is good for their necks to be longer. So the longer their necks get, the better chance they have at surviving. Therefore, the longer necked giraffes are going to be able to create more offspring than the shorter necked giraffes. And this is kind of actually how we think giraffes may have evolved over time, how their necks may have changed over history. So this is just a nice way to kind of compare and contrast the thinking of Lamarck and the thinking of Darwin. All right, so I do want to give us a little bit more detail about Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So when we think about the history of Darwin, Charles Darwin traveled around the world in the 1830s as a naturalist with the British Navy. So this is happening quite a while ago, a couple hundred years ago from where we are now. And he obviously this time they just kind of had ships as their main way of traveling. So he was along with this ship called the HMS Beagle, and they were responsible for going around the world, and he was kind of along on the boat and was taking observations as a naturalist, as a scientist. Darwin's theory of evolution, or Darwin's theory of natural selection, was largely based on observations on animals like finches living on the Galapagos Islands in South America. So if you've heard about the theory of natural selection before, if you've heard about Charles Darwin, you've also probably heard of the Galapagos Islands. So this area was really, really important for Darwin in the formation of his theory. And what I've actually included here is a picture of what some of these finches, these types of birds that live on the Galapagos Islands, what they look like. So this is kind of reiterating the idea of natural selection, exactly what it means. So natural selection tells us is that organisms that have adaptations that allow them to survive more successfully than others in their species, and they have more offspring. So organisms are going to have these adaptations that allow them to survive more successfully than others, and that's going to allow them to have more offspring. That's kind of the basis of Darwin's thinking. The better you are at surviving, the more offspring you can have. When we think about this word adaptations, this is a word we're going to be using a lot. We define the word adaptations as any heritable characteristic that affects an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. And I know it can be difficult introducing another new word here, but we kind of know this word already. If we think back to our genetics unit, we talked about heredity. Heredity is the process where a parent passes down characteristics to their offspring. So this is basically saying any trait or characteristics that can be passed down from parent to offspring, that would be considered an adaptation. And this is, again, going to affect their ability to survive and reproduce. That's the context we're considering adaptations in. Another important term that goes along with Darwin's theory is an idea called fitness. And when we think about fitness as humans, we think of this as maybe working out or being a really good athlete. And it's kind of a similar idea for Darwin, but he kind of puts it in a slightly different context here. Fitness, he defines it as a measure of how well an organism can survive and reproduce. So, the better you are at staying alive and being able to create offspring, Darwin would consider that to be high fitness. So you are a fit individual if you're able to survive and reproduce. This is why the theory of natural selection can often be called survival of the fittest. That's kind of where this term comes from, if you ever heard that phrase before. Survival of the fittest, the organisms that are most fit, the organisms that can best survive and reproduce are gonna be what are called the fittest. It's those who survive. And kind of just showing the correlation here, the more offspring you have, the higher fitness you have. So those two are kind of positively correlated. The more fitness you have, the more offspring you have, the higher fitness you have. The less offspring you have, the lower fitness you have. All right. There's a little bit more that I want to say about adaptations and where they come from in particular. And you may be a little confused why I'm showing you a picture of some birds. For one thing, I really do enjoy birds. I think birds are pretty cool animals. But what we can hopefully notice here is that all of these different types of birds, hopefully we recognize these, is like a duck, a woodpecker, a hawk, a cardinal, maybe a finch. So these are all different types of birds, and they all kind of have different structures in their body. What I want to ask you to actually do right now is to actually pause the video and take a look at the shape of the beaks of our birds and the shape of their feet. Think about why the shapes of their beak and feet might be helpful to let them survive. Go ahead and pause the video, take a second to think through how these structures might be helpful to them. So when we consider all of these different structures that these birds have, we should notice that these can all be adaptations for these birds. Ducks want to be good at swimming, so they're going to adapt to have these webbed feet, so feet that allow them to more easily swim through the water. They also have these bills here that are going to allow them to filter as they're kind of sticking their head below water to grab food. These bills are really good for that. A duck foot is also going to look very different from the foot of a hawk or an eagle, for example. These are going to be mainly more carnivores. They're going to be kind of swooping down and grabbing their prey off the ground. So they want to have these sharp talons here that are really good at kind of making sure that they can get a tight grip on their prey. And then their beak also looks very different from the bill of a duck. This beak here is going to be sharp. It's going to be really good at tearing meat because that is how they're going to get their food. So I think it's really interesting to consider birds and how they're well adapted to kind of fulfill these different functions that they need to. When we think about where adaptations come from, again, adaptations being traits that affect an organism's ability to survive, we're going to say that adaptations are caused by mutations in an organism's DNA. So this is where genetics and DNA kind of really comes in to this idea of evolution. As a reminder, when we talked about mutations, these are going to be considered changes in DNA that lead to changes in an organism, changing their anatomy or way that they live. So that's basically going to mean that if something changes in your DNA, that's going to change how you look, that's going to change how you act, that's going to change how you live your life. So these mutations, these changes in our DNA, are going to basically lead to adaptations. And this is kind of a really, really, really important point of thinking about how natural selection occurs and how things evolve. And that idea is that mutations are the driving force of evolution and natural selection. The reason for this is that mutations are going to happen in our DNA all the time. There's going to be accidental mistakes that happen. Sometimes these mistakes are going to be bad and they can actually cause us as organisms to not be able to survive. But sometimes these mutations are going to cause good things. They're going to make us taller or stronger, or they're going to make us just more likely to survive. And those changes come about, those randomly happen because of mutations. And therefore, because these mutations are going to cause these changes in our bodies, it's going to change how well we can survive and therefore affect how well we can pass down our traits to the next generation. So we can kind of consider mutations as being the driving force of evolution and natural selection. So as I was kind of mentioning up there, some adaptations are going to allow organisms to survive better or worse than others in their species. For example, if you were to get a good adaptation from a mutation, that's going to allow you to survive longer and therefore create more offspring, giving you a higher fitness. But sometimes there could be a bad adaptation that would cause you to survive for less time and would cause you to create less offspring, therefore lowering your fitness. An important thing to consider, though, is that this can actually be dependent on the environment where an organism is living. And I think this is an interesting thing to consider, is that an adaptation in one situation can be bad, but in another situation could be good. To demonstrate this, the words in these boxes aren't super important. It's more the pictures that really kind of tell the story here. So we're considering a species of bunnies that are mainly going to have this kind of dark black fur color. So this is kind of the natural fur color of these bunnies, and they live, as we can see, kind of at the foot of this mountain that is actually covered in this really dark soil. So the ground is very dark. And these bunnies are well adapted to living in their environment because they kind of blend in. We would call this camouflage. These bunnies are well camouflaged in their environment, so it's going to be harder for prey to be able to see them. It's going to be less likely that they get caught, for example. What we see here in our second picture is that a mutation occurred. So one of these bunnies had an offspring, and a mutation occurred in their DNA, causing them to have a lighter skin color. So we could consider this an adaptation. This is going to be something that changes in the organism that affects their ability to survive. The reason why it affects their ability to survive is that against this dark background, this dark soil, this lighter colored bunny is going to be much easier for this eagle, for example, to kind of see, and it's going to be much easier prey. Therefore, it's not going to live as long, and it's going to have a tougher time surviving. So this is one way that this adaptation can happen. However, we're now going to consider this same type of bunny, but living in a different area, living in a different environment. So we see here the same group of bunnies from our second picture, but now they're living kind of on a savanna where it's much more open and the ground is a much lighter color. So these dark bunnies, unfortunately, actually stick out in this environment. These dark colored fur is actually going to make it really easy for a predator to see them. But if this mutation occurs, this one bunny is probably going to have a better chance of surviving because they're going to be harder to find. So we can see here in the second picture, some of our darker colored bunnies disappeared because they were easier to see. But because this lighter colored bunny is going to have a better chance of surviving, they're going to be able to create more offspring. And therefore, it's possible that the entire kind of population could kind of take this adaptation, and now all of our bunnies by the end of it are going to be light colored. So again, this kind of shows us that when we consider adaptations, you also have to consider the situation that we're in. Some are going to be good for the situation, or some are going to be good, and some are going to be bad. So I think it's an interesting example to consider. All right, how I want to wrap up here is kind of talking about some evidence of evolution. How are we able to observe evolution occurring over time? When we think about it, evolution is difficult to observe as it is a process that can take millions of years to occur. So it was once difficult for scientists to accept that evolution was a thing and that it actually happened because evolution happens very, very slowly. It takes a long time for evolution to happen. But once we started doing research into it, we often observed changes in fossil records, so changes in fossils over time, or by noticing small changes in a species overall. This is how scientists tried to start to pick apart ways that evolution could be occurring. So when we think about this, this happens by scientists comparing what is alive now to what was alive millions of years ago, or looking at the fossils of the same species from different time periods to see how they may have changed. So if you look at a giraffe skeleton from 1,000 years ago compared to a giraffe skeleton from 100,000 years ago, seeing how those skeletons are different, how their size may have changed, that might give us some clues into how evolution may have occurred. However, there are some more easily observable examples that happen in a much shorter period of time. And one popular one actually includes the finches that Darwin originally observed on the Galapagos Islands. So once Darwin released his research, ever since then, there have kind of been some researchers who have been interested in these ideas and have actually been studying Darwin's finches on Galapagos Islands. So researchers took some data. This happened in 1976 on this island called Daphne Island. And they basically took the average beak depth measurement. So this bird, for example, has a shorter beak depth. It's smaller here, while this bird has a larger beak depth. And they're measuring how large their beak depth was. And we see that in 1976, the mean or average beak depth was about 9.5 millimeters. That was about the average there. To kind of point out the caption here. So what happened after 1976 is that there was actually a drought on the Galapagos island of Daphne Major in 1977, and this reduced the number of small seeds available to finches, causing many of the small-beaked finches to die. This caused an increase in the finch's average beak size between 1976 and 1978. So the reason why it may be beneficial for these birds to have different sized beaks is because these smaller beaks are going to be better at getting smaller seeds, while these larger beaks are going to be better at getting larger seeds. So before I show you what happens, I want you to take a second to think. If this drought is going to cause less small seeds to be available, what do we think might happen to the average beak depth size? So if there's less small seeds, and it may be harder for these smaller beaked birds to survive, what might happen? And hopefully we may have guessed that after this drought in 1977, when they took this reading again in 1978, we can see that the average beak depth actually went up. And this means that in this entire population on this island, the average beak depth was larger because of this change in their environment. And this is kind of a miniature form of evolution. This single event of this drought happening in 1977 caused this population of these birds on Daphne Island to evolve, causing them to have a larger beak depth. So this is just one example of ways that we can see evolution more on a small scale. All right, that's all that I have for you all. Thank you all for watching.